Hello, my name is Russell Myers. Welcome to Issues Unite. Hoping I don't look pale here. I haven't been out in the sun or even to the tanning bed much for a while here. All right, I'm going to give credit of some of the thoughts expressed here to Glenn Greenwald, The Intercept, on System Update, titled Is the U.S. Social Fabric Unraveling? I advise watching this episode as it gives many things to think about and statistics which I will not delve into here, but are extremely enlightening. There's no question that we are living in revolutionary times. That is not referring to the protests occurring, though that is definitely a part of it. Societal revolutions do not have to include mass protests or violence, though they generally do. Instead, think of the Industrial Revolution as an example. While there were absolutely a number of protests, strikes, riots, and uprisings, those are not the reason that we call that time a revolution. A revolution is a period of drastic social, political, and economic change. A revolution may occur because of changes in the society itself, or it may be brought about by technological advancements, natural disasters, or other influences. Most revolutions which occur as a result of changes within the society itself are events which seem to happen suddenly. The truth is that these revolutions typically have been brewing at varying levels under the surface for years, possibly generations, just waiting for the final trigger to set large events in motion. The ruling establishment during a revolution always tries to make the influences and demands of a revolution seem limited, singular in scope, anti-patriotic, and trivial or overstated. This is nothing more than an attempt to limit the scope of changes which are genuinely needed within a society, but are opposed by the most wealthy and powerful for their own exaggerated and greedy benefit above the rest of society. Above and beyond all else, for the privileged of society, a revolution is a battle of propaganda. It is information control and manipulation. Their efforts focus on turning even slightly differing cohorts of the population against one another, whether locally, regionally, or globally. Male against female, race against race, religion against religion, nation against nation, and so on and so on. These efforts are generally successful for the majority of the population who are easily manipulated and controlled. The purpose is to divert attention from the fact that it is the most privileged within that society who pulls the strings, depriving even the most basic of rights from the population while profiting from doing so. However, the success of these efforts become less and less effective as the suffering and disadvantages imposed upon limited segments of the population continue expanding to encompass larger and larger cohorts. The major reversal truly begins when those that once viewed themselves as privileged and immune to being deprived of resources, then find themselves in the same position as those they once looked down upon as inferior. This is the point where we are at now. It is no longer the minorities suffering alone. The lines drawn across all cultural, ethnic, religious, and gender boundaries have blurred. The only lines existing are between the rich and the poor, with a defined middle class no longer existing. This means more and more sectors of society now identify with those who have historically been oppressed. Greater and greater numbers of people now find themselves below the poverty line, unable to afford basic necessities such as food, shelter, and medical care. Thus, we see protests which once would have been small and limited in scope, now growing ever larger in scale. The more authorities attempt to suppress these protests using violent methods, the more the protests become more forceful in nature. Yet at this point, the majority of protests have remained peaceful in nature or involved property damage, with most injuries being inflicted by authorities on the protesters. In some instances, pro-establishment counter-protesters infiltrate peaceful protests for the purpose of causing physical harm or killing people involved in the protests. This is an attempt to invalidate the protests and make those engaged in actual protest seem criminal in nature. The end result of all the rising violence is highly predictable and unavoidable, seeing that the establishment has absolutely no intention of offering any form of response besides further oppression. Police and fascistic elements will continue with increasing violence, incarceration, invalidation, and sanctions against those who object. Eventually, the previously peaceful protesters who have limited their actions to property damage at most will see no other option but to engage force with force. Once that happens, there will be no going back. This point was illustrated this past week when both Trump and Biden spoke of law and order methods of suppressing protests, with neither suggesting systemic changes, which are the entire focus of the protests. Neither one wants to address systemic changes, police violence, etc. Now, I referenced the Greenwald report because his report brought attention to the increasing level of depression among American citizens. This has been a growing problem for over 2 decades, beginning in the late 90s. And that has been illustrated by the rise of antidepressant medication use in the population. It's highly telling that this illustration began during the tail end of the internet boom years. However, in the past 5 years, the problem has escalated at a rapid pace. In the past year alone, as many as 10% of Americans polled said they had considered suicide at some point within the past year. Meanwhile, addiction rates have skyrocketed, along with fatal overdose rates. Make no mistake, a large percentage of overdose deaths are intentional, whether stated as such or not. All of what I have spoken of to this point are indications of a vast number of people in this country that are craving significant changes to our societal and economic system. Yet we have been denied that change, even when or if it has been promised. You remember hope and change, do you? The changes we have seen have been the exact opposite of what have been promised. The result is where we are now. Rising numbers and increasing scales of protests with more human-on-human violence occurring more and more frequently. While I do not truly endorse the destruction or looting of property, we must recognize that in a capitalist, materialistic society, the destruction and theft of inanimate objects are a valid form of protest against that system. There is no other way by which such a system will change. There is no profit motive in change until protests inflict a cost in maintaining that system, depriving that system of a profit motive. Many sculptures and symbols have been destroyed by protesters. Those symbols are destroyed for the very reason that they are emblematic of oppression and slavery. While more and more people have realized their own oppression and slavery to a system which increasingly strips them of their freedom, liberties, human rights, and even dignity on a societal scale. The media and general rhetorical narrative have focused on only the racial aspect of these protests. The racial aspect is quite valid, but is far from the entirety of the motivation for these protests. This involves far more, and over the coming weeks and months, that will become undeniable, even by the propagandist media. John F. Kennedy said, "Those that make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." As of now, with both the incumbent president and his major opponent both promising increasing use of force, the hope of peaceful revolution being effective has been completely stripped away. This leaves an already emotionally exhausted, increasingly desperate population in a position with few choices remaining. The fact of so many already suffering depression and anxiety to the degree that they have been left considering taking their own lives makes these people formidable adversaries for the power structure. You cannot take away anything from a person that has nothing left to lose. There is no effective threat against that person. Most of the overt use of human violence up to this point has been inflicted by right-wing and establishment entities. Yet we must include denial of freedom of speech, shelter, food, safety, and medical care as forms of violence in and of themselves. All denials of human rights, which are becoming more and more common and affecting more and more millions in this country, are affecting a growing number of people on a daily basis. Estimates range as high as 40 million households may face eviction, and up to 50 million Americans may face food insecurity by the end of this year. And I would consider that a highly conservative estimate. Meanwhile, firearms saw the greatest increase in sales in U.S. history for single months in July and August of this year. Over 30 million people are listed as unemployed, with tens of millions more that are underemployed. The combination of deprivation of human rights, increasing use of violence, and increasing arms sales is a clear shadow of what is to come. The left will begin to respond to violence with violence. The right and establishment operate under the assumption that the historically peaceful left will remain that way or be less capable or proficient with the use of firearms and weapons. Yet there is absolutely no evidence to support that belief, especially considering that the left tends to have higher education levels and far greater numbers. Considering then that the highest percentage of those on the right are facing the same conditions as those on the left, there will be considerable crossover into alliances between left and right against the establishment. In simple terms, we are at this moment seeing what future historians will consider the beginning of a new American Civil War. Active duty military and National Guard units will be mobilized, though we can expect to see mass numbers of defections and mutinies of personnel, possibly entire units, bringing their weapons with them and fighting against the establishment on the side of the people. These events can no longer be prevented by the forces in power, though it can easily be foreseen. The fact that they unanimously voice stances directly opposing what could prevent that civil war indicates that this is the intentional goal. The only question now is time. What will be the final trigger that detonates these conditions? What will it be? Because obviously people being evicted from their homes, being tens of thousands in multiple cities at a time, adding up to millions of American citizens lined up for food banks, people having their power turned off, their utilities cut off, sometimes even when they paid the bills. Where does this stop? What is going to be the final trigger? When is enough going to be enough? Is it going to be one more police shooting of an unarmed person? I guess we're just going to have to wait and see. But I don't expect that trigger to be far off. I do not expect that it is going to, I don't think we've got until November before we hit that trigger. And if you think that the election is going to calm things down with either side winning, that's more likely to be a trigger in and of itself. Anyway, please share this video. Talk about these subjects. If you can, please donate $1 a month to help expand the channel. And I hope you have a good weekend.